Hi, good to have you, everybody. Welcome back to Adapters TechX. I'm your host, Sean Worker, where we explore the business travel trends and fads in the service industry across travel, tourism, hospitality, restaurants, and all things in services. This is one of those shows that's powered by, as always, our friends at Hunter Gatherer with Art Lowry and with No Vacancy Live with Glenn Hausman. No Vacancy Live is the number one influencer podcast in the United States in the space. And we are working on bringing you the messages about travel tech and all things tech in and around and all over the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. So I'm delighted to have Gavin Bluett. He's a partner at MacSweeney Law in Galway, Ireland. One of the, probably, I am biased, but nonetheless, one of the most fabulous cities to live in from a quality of life in the world. That being said, it's also a big center when it comes to tech, everything from med tech to travel tech to, enablers that support services and just lots of other startups. And Gavin is well known in the circle of startups across multiple sectors across Ireland, and brings a wealth of experience in the things you should do and the things you don't. On our Quick Hit podcast, Gavin is very succinct, which is unusual for a lawyer, and in the sense that I'm a solicitor, that he gets to the point, and you got to listen to that show because it's very meaningful, and there's 4 great tips and takes that applies to basically any company, but particularly when it comes to startups and tech. He has been with the firm just under a year, moved down from Dublin to Galway. And, the firm is full service. It's a boutique full service firm that every type of corporate and commercial transaction. And, I'm going to rapid fire through all the categories that the team service, everything from equity, debt, investments, corporate finance, restructuring, buying and selling, the old mergers and acquisitions, but VCs, venture capital, and private equity. And then equally, Gavin is a specialist in SaaS, software as a service, and all the complications that goes with that as you build the tech stack, as well as sports. And of course, he's into sports. We're all into sports in Ireland. That's just the way it is. So either way, you got to tag it with sports.
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Compliments on your 10-minute get to the point. You know how to get to the point. So
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that.
Billing, everybody out there, that's good for your billing. So Gavin, we kind of left off on the other side, and you really, if you really would, I think your tips and takes were very succinct, and I think it'll build out for a very nice 30 to 40 minute chat. Could I really impose on you to just share those again right at the top of this show?
Yeah, of course. So as I was saying to you, it's the boring stuff, I suppose, but, documenting everything. So oftentimes with early stage companies, and sort of actually it's not just early stage companies, to be quite honest with you, it goes to companies that have been around for a long time, but people tend to get themselves into various situations and scenarios where they've agreed certain things, but they haven't reduced anything to writing, which causes major upheaval of future events. And to just actually give you a real life example of that, there was a transaction I worked on a few years ago where a company, again, SaaS technology as it happens, but it was being acquired. It had been on the go for a good number of years. It had gone from being a small company to a relatively large company, a few hundred employees. And it had a CEO who was a real generous kind of a guy and, promised the sun, moon and the stars to everyone, including equity stakes and what have you. But of course, there wasn't everything reduced to writing. So when it came to, at the time, for the company to actually be sold and acquired on an outright basis, you had people coming out of the woodwork, left, right and centre, saying that, so-and-so he told me I could have this number of shares, that number of shares, or I was granted this option. And again, that all has to be then resolved when you're actually looking, you're at a good news story, you're at an exit, and all of a sudden this is a sort of an unmerciful headache that you want to have. So that's bringing it back to the point, I suppose, is put everything in writing. If you agree, that you're going to take 50,000 euro off someone and you're going to give them 100 shares, whatever the case may be, make sure it's in writing. It doesn't matter if that's your mum, your dad, your brother, your sister, whatever, friends or family, put it in writing. One of the other pieces we talked about was having good corporate housekeeping. And by that, I mean, if you set up a company, you have, and of course, most tech startups are a company structure, but you're going to have various obligations that go with that. So making filings with the company's registration office when the company undertakes certain actions, maintaining certain registers, making filings with the revenue commissioners, making filings with what's called the register of beneficial ownership. But make sure you do those things, because again, if you go take on some future fundraising, if you're going for an exit at some stage in the future, someone like me, some boring lawyer, is going to be trawling through your dirty laundry, and we're going to spot if it's not done right. And it just, as much as anything, like investment and legals, even, it's a confidence game. If we're looking at your business and there's kind of things left, right, and centre that aren't really as they should be, that starts putting questions in our head. Well, if this isn't done, what else isn't done? And that sort of a thing. So the other point, I suppose, going back to the shareholders agreement that we talked about, was reducing everything to writing. That document, to elaborate a bit further, when you have a company that's set up with new people, they should put a founders agreement in place. And the sort of things you want to see in there are the core things. Is, as I see it, is number one, what's everyone getting for what they're putting in at the outset? Number two, if someone ultimately wants to leave, if they want out, what happens with their shares? You don't want a scenario where, say, Sean, if you and I set up a company together and ultimately after a year's time, I'm like, I'm fed up with it, not for me, that I can just go down the road and flag my shares to any old Tom, Dick or Harry. You want to have a right of first refusal. So you want to have built-in provisions that say, in the event that one of us leaves, we have to give the other person first shot at buying us out at a reasonable price. Another thing you want to have in there is, look, if it all goes Pete-Tong, dispute resolution provisions, we don't want it to go straight down to the High Court where we're stealing the pants off each other. Let's try and have some sort of a mechanism in place where we really do exhaust all other alternative mechanisms to solve that issue. So they're the sort of things. And also, how do we plan for a future fundraising event? If it so happens that we're going to future fundraise, how's that going to happen and how are we going to deal with it? And then the last point I think we discussed forgive me, I'm kind of babbling now, but I think the last point we discussed was the IP ownership. So again, with the tech companies, really the IP is the really behind, as well as the team that are behind the company. That's obviously one of the crucial things, but the other thing really is the IP. That's what's going to be most important and most valuable. So you want to make sure that's actually owned by the company itself. And why I'm saying that is there is scenarios, and I've seen it happen in the past, where, again, if we take the example of you and I, Sean, if we come together, we're both two techies, or we're great, software developers, whatever the case may be, and without any kind of a plan or structure in place, we just start hammering out an idea, developing software, developing code, whatever the case may be, or developing a product. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately later on, we decide we'll set up a company, whatever the case may be, but we don't formally transfer ownership of that IP into the company. That can cause serious issues at a future date, where if you're going to invest or look for investment in the company, you want to be damn sure that it's the company that owns the IP, and there's no question that it's Sean Worker that owns it or Gavin Bluett that owns it in a personal capacity. And likewise, taking that a bit further, when a company's gotten a bit bigger and it's taken on additional staff, or maybe it's a case that you cannot get the staff or people to work directly for you that have the skills you need, so you start outsourcing. I mean, that's quite common to see. Often you'll see a lot of guys outsourcing, even to Eastern Europe, to developers over there to assist with the production of, or the development of tech and products. You want to make sure that you have really robust agreements in place, making it crystal clear that all IP that's developed is owned by the company, not by the developer. And if somehow something slips through the cracks and that IP is deemed somehow or other to be owned by the developer or the employee, you want provisions built into those agreements saying, you will do everything in your power to sign that ownership over to us. You'll even appoint us under a power of attorney to do it. That kind of stuff. It's that important, as I see it. They're sort of I think they're all of the pillars. I may have missed one or two, but I think that's what we talked about.
No, yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like, now you just got married. Did you do a prenup? Don't answer that question. But,
I married another lawyer for my sins. So.
Yeah. So so the good news is it's the same principle. Think of what the end is in mind, and you have to be hopeful. If you're not hopeful when you're starting a business, then if you can't write it down as to what the outcomes should be, mm-hmm. and having that honest conversation with your startup partners.
Yeah,
probably could weed out a partner earlier than later when they face what the reality is, opposed to the passion of the idea.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you've seen that too.
Yeah, well, just to give you a real life example of that, what I've seen one time where that really did weed out someone who was kind of just humming and hawing as to whether they were fully interested or not. But oftentimes you'll see in agreements is like a lock-in period at the outset. So, if we come together, we're saying that for 5 years post inception of this plan, either we can't leave, or if we do leave, we're getting nothing for our shares. Those shares are coming back to the other shareholders, or they're coming back to the company, but you're getting either a discount or you're getting nothing. And the reason being, the logic behind that is that, look, nothing happens. Rome wasn't built in a day. You know, this isn't going to be a quick buck that we're going to earn here. We're going to need to put in 2, 3, 4, 5 years of hard graft before we're actually going to see a return on our sweat equity investment here. But I've seen that clause literally has gotten people, you know, oh, I'm all about it. I'm here for the show, the long road. Okay, sign this agreement with that clause. No, not for me. No, thank you. So that is like having those hard conversations up front can weed out someone who's, you know, a bit of a journeyman, maybe not fully committed. But you're right, it's a marriage. And that same thing goes then if you're taking on investors. That's another form of marriage, you know. And I would say, like one of the big things I would say that's really important is investors and companies, the founders, need to make sure their interests are aligned. And when I say that, I mean, you might have an investor, even if you take some of the funds that are around, you know, some of the funds have been raised on a specific mandate where they have to have a return on investment for their own investors within a set period of time. So what's your own company's plans going forward? Do you see an exit in 5 years, or is this a 10-year plan, or is it a 15-year plan? There's not much point in having an investor come in for 5 years who's going to want, you know, an exit with a coupon in 5 years if that doesn't sort of sync up with your own plan. So you do need to diligence the companies need to diligence the investors as much as the investors need to diligence the company to make sure that there's the same vision and same plan. And ultimately as well, you know, are they a right fit? You know, I think I said to you in the short video earlier that oftentimes you'll see, particularly with the early stage investors now, they're trying to de-risk their investments to such an extent that they're almost hamstringing the company by wanting to be involved in every decision that's made, you know, having veto rights over things they really shouldn't have. I mean, it's understandable to say, all right, a veto right is you're not allowed to spend, you know, 50 grand without coming to us first to get our approval, something like that. But it shouldn't be a case that you can't be making everyday decisions without having to get the input of the investors, if you know what I mean. So you need to make sure the interests are aligned there as well. And I suppose the other thing for companies to take on board as well and think about is, you know, what's the actual cost of the money that they're taking on board? You know, is it just the coupon, or is there something else that's been looked for? You might see sort of crazy provisions being thrown into agreements with sort of just, you know, off-market sort of redemption or buybacks of the rights or whatever the case may be. And the other thing, the last one finally, I think when you're talking about marriages here is, as well as taking on their money, what else is that investor bringing to the company, to the table? So, I mean, they might have something that's more valuable than the money itself in terms of they might have the ability to open doors to a market you haven't been able to get to. They may have skill sets that you just haven't been able to get on the board already. You know, or they may have access to additional funding that you wouldn't otherwise get. So those are the sort of things you need to be thinking about. It's not just someone's giving me £1 million. It's what else are they bringing to the table and what's the real cost of that £1 million.
Yeah, when you look at the essence of what you're speaking to is, you know, it's not dissimilar for the same principles of hiring a coder or an employee. Same principles, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fit and capability.
Exactly.
Right. So are they a cultural fit, right? Yeah. Are they able to contribute?
Exactly.
Do they have previous knowledge, or they have connections or network, or they're a specialist in one of the coding languages? You know, Cobalt probably wouldn't be helpful. Maybe Ruby on Rails would. But nonetheless, these principles are good business principles, let alone tech startup or business formation about how to do it right. So, you know, with the firm, how do you communicate that when you're trying to essentially add clients to your base? How do you make those connections with your clients in this way? I mean, it's a very practical approach. Most solicitors and lawyers aren't that practical sometimes. So well, how do you go about it? Because obviously you got a different style how you think about this. So how do you go about it, Gavin?
Well, you kind of have to build it. You're not just a lawyer or a solicitor. You're kind of a trusted advisor is the approach I take. I like to say to guys as well, to clients, and to be honest with you, maybe I'm not a traditional lawyer, but I have quite an interest in the business. I love, my favorite part of a transaction is getting under the hood of a company and starting to understand what makes it tick. So I'm probably a bit more invested, spend more time talking to people generally out of just a genuine interest, not on the clock, unfortunately, but just genuine interest in what's going on and how it's going. So I take the approach of trying to listen to what people are doing, where it is they want to go, and take as much of my past experiences. It's probably not strictly legal advice, if you know what I mean, but it's more, look, this is what I've seen in the past, what I've seen work and it hasn't worked. Here's where I've seen people get bitten on the bottom of things. You know, maybe it's have that in mind when you're when you're going out looking for investors, whatever the case may be. Another one that it's funny, a lot of times I've had guys call looking for advice or whatnot, and the conversation has ended up with, rather than being a strict legal advice conversation, but more saying, you don't need to talk to me so much, but you need to talk to a more seasoned entrepreneur, someone who's actually got the battle scars, has been through the sort of struggles you're currently facing, and talk to them and learn from their mistakes and their trials, if you know what I mean. And there's so much opportunity and so many people out there who are willing to speak, I find, nowadays. And there's so many places you can easily go if you're an entrepreneur, particularly a tech entrepreneur, if you want to speak to someone. So, I mean, if you're in Dublin, you've got any number of them, but like Dogpatch Labs and the IFSC I used to work next door to, was a great place where you can go down, talk to guys. In Galway, you've got the Porter Shed, fantastic team in there, and a fantastic number of companies working in there, any one of which will be willing to talk to anyone. I mean, in Cork, you've got the Republic of Working Places, and then anywhere else across the country, they're scattered, if you know what I mean. They're in smaller towns like Dundalk, they're down in places in Kerry and whatnot. It's everywhere. And what people are really willing to chat in Ireland. I'm sure you know it, but we love to talk. And people are willing to share their stories and sort of share their advice. So that's the sort of stuff I'd often be saying to guys, is talk to the people within your peer network, even if you don't know them. But like, go down to the Porter Shed, go down to the Dogpatch Labs, go to one of their breakfast mornings, have a cup of coffee. You'll probably learn more from one of those things than you will from any conversation with the likes of me. But and then the other thing is to go to as many of the sort of seminars as possible that are around. So like the various master classes that are held by the likes of the NDRC, there's the New Frontiers program, and a lot of these things are free before you even have to sign up to any of them. There's like so many online events, in-person events, and I'd be saying to people, go to as many of these as you can, and build out your network, know what's going on, who's involved in what. That's kind of how I'd impart that information, I suppose.
The thing that certainly moving back to Ireland, that it does resemble the tech community globally, and something that I think most business people don't do, and this included me until I discovered tech, was opening up and saying, I don't know. Tell me.
Yeah.
I found in non-tech oriented basic businesses, there's this fear of saying, I don't know. And I felt that when I started learning about platforms many years ago, and I remember going to some of the bigger names like Airbnb and places like that, said, look, I just don't know what you do. I have no idea whether you're a friend or foe or we could work together or not. It really takes a lot of the BS off the table pretty quickly. Yeah. And that's what I think the tech community does very well, that I think a lot of other industries that either use software as a service or they are pure startup, I'm solving a global problem, learn how to do that and network through now enablement platforms like the Porter Shed, right?
Yeah.
Would you mind just, for the sake of the audience, what is the Porter Shed? What is the Republic of Work? What do they do? Just for everybody. What's the
Yeah, so I suppose like they're co-working spaces in one sense, if you know what I mean. There's hot desks or desk areas you can rent, but then there's like all sorts of communities that are run through them as well. So I mean, in terms of events, the Porter Shed in Galway, run by Mary Rogers up there and Anthony Shaughnessy and the guys. I think there's an event every other day of the week, if not numerous events per day. Everything from sort of like from the tech side of things to financial advice. They'll have open office hours, if you know what I mean. You'll have the NDRC up there, Enterprise Ireland are involved, and then the Republic of Work, which is another great service operated out of Cork City, does exactly the same thing. It's a co-working space. It's got meeting rooms that can be used. It's an event space. And then again, you'll have the likes of the NDRC or Enterprise Ireland operating out of there. The IDA are in and out of there the whole time as well. And it's just a flow through of fantastic people and fantastic information, if you know what I mean. So anytime I've gone to either any of these places for a cup of coffee, purely by the chance of being there, you will never know who you'll bump into, if you know what I mean. You might bump into, like, if take a Porter Shed is the one closest to me, I'm there quite regularly, so that's the easiest one to speak about. But pop in for a cup of coffee, the next thing you're having a cup of coffee with someone from the IDA that's there. It might be, I think there was one day I was there, was that the online website, The Knot. I don't know if you know that one, the wedding website. The head of legal was there purely by chance, popped over, a chance to have a cup of coffee here, what they're doing, exchange business cards. Again, look, things do or don't come from it work-wise, but again, the amount of information you get from these places is just phenomenal.
So, I think the other message to the other geographies that we speak with is network. Find these places. Now, in these examples that we just had, they're dedicated largely to tech, and so they're enabling the businesses to have services and knowledge grabs and knowledge sharing that they ordinarily wouldn't have if they rented an office down the street and locked themselves away. It's an efficient way for them to focus on their business while getting the services or the moons that service, the sun. So that's an amazing thing. And I think that's pretty unique in some respects in Ireland, that fuels then the enablement of startups and best practices and getting the ecosystem that drives that business, including obviously, valuable specialist legal services that you offer, that makes it much easier. So that's pretty cool. And then there's obviously innovation hubs at different colleges that network into that. And just for context, the IDA is a industrial development, isn't it? The Irish Development Authority.
Exactly, yeah. They're responsible essentially for trying to encourage foreign direct investment.
Right, investment. And, to have that sort of connection point into the major markets through that conduit is very insightful and progressive, that the government agencies are embedding themselves there as well. So that's really wonderful to see. So just, you obviously thought about all this stuff. And I think one of the questions I was going to ask you is like, what are some of the, you read a lot, you've done a lot, what's some of the stuff you've read, or where are the influences that have, kind of spawned this thinking and where you are today? I mean, is it books? Is it drama? Was it, where you went to school?
Honestly, I don't know. It's probably past experiences to an extent. Books-wise, it's funny when I was thinking about this the last day when you asked me to think about a book I've read. But actually, I devour books at the best of times. But try and think of any one particular book that stands out. There's only one that springs to mind, and it's Slash, the guitarist from Guns N' Roses, his autobiography, which I read in my early 20s. I think I remember reading it on a holiday in Greece, and I couldn't put it down. It was so hot. The book melted, like it literally fell apart. The glue fell apart. I was reading it. But this book, now again, totally unrelated to tech or entrepreneurial.
Okay, so first of all, this is Slash from Guns N' Roses, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So just for context, now, because Slash has different meanings. So so Slash, what stood out? I mean, that is the last book that I would have thought you were going to bring up. So. Okay, you got to go into this. Come on.
What it is, like, first of all, the book, when you read it, it is just page turn after page turn of shocking. But ultimately, what I enjoyed about it was it's someone taking the road less traveled again. It's that kind of, but most of us do the sensible thing. We go to school, we work hard. We go to college, we work hard. These guys, complete lunatics, musicians, sex, drugs, and rock and roll on levels. How they're still alive, beyond me. I do not understand. But successful careers, to go on and just, I think it's that risk-taking side of things. If that's what's interesting about it. It's definitely the road less traveled, thinking outside the box and having a crack at something way left field. Yeah, exactly, absolutely. And that's again, I've read it a few times since, but that's one. Like, and I do read all the tech books. I read all the self-help books, all the sort of the entrepreneurial ones as well. But that's the one that comes back to again thinking. I think it's a case of like we can all go and do the sensible thing, and most of us do. But what interests me in the tech and the entrepreneur side of things is people who are taking a chance. They're not necessarily going and working for a big company. They're going working for themselves or getting together with a couple of other guys and like putting their neck above, lifting their head out of the trenches and saying, let's give it a crack. And as you said, not being afraid to fail. Because most of us are afraid to fail, if you know what I mean. So we take the safe route, which is successful. Whereas these guys, you have to be able to, take the hits, take beatings. You're probably going to have more failures than successes. And I just think it's really, I admire it, to be honest with you. I wish I had the guts to be a tech entrepreneur myself, in terms of, I try to be as entrepreneurial as I can in terms of doing things a little bit differently. In terms of like getting out and about, meeting people, trying to find new ways of doing the work, new ways of getting the work in, getting chances to talk to people like this, presenting to things, or presenting wherever I can. So that's part of that probably came from some of the previous places I've worked. One firm I worked in was quite small when I started. There was 7 of us. By the time I left, there was 50. But they put a great sort of emphasis on the ability to go out and win work, if you know what I mean. And that's probably part of where the interest in the entrepreneurship comes from. It's not a case of the traditional lawyer sitting at a desk and waiting for mountains and mountains of work to land on your desk. That's there anyways. But personally, what I find interesting about the job is, number one, getting out to meet people, getting out to hear what they're doing and how they're doing it. And then three, ultimately, like, we're all salespeople, no matter what business you're in. If you're not in sales, you're not going to do very well. I enjoy the thrill of the chase of a bit of getting work, going out.
This all came from Slash. I feel like I've lost most of my life and go grab that. And I'm probably now going to read it in that sense, which is contrary to leading a good, healthy lifestyle. And look, everybody survived. If Keith Richards can survive, anybody can survive.
Exactly.
So it's amazing what influences us. And, that's very interesting when you kind of take what I heard was the essence of reading, Slash's thing was, it's taking that risk. And if you're into it, go for it and live that lifestyle the way you want to live it. And tying that back to what you're doing, there's this thing that we've also explored on the show on different things about the entrepreneur within, right? So it's the person that probably just isn't built to throw it all on the table, but is very entrepreneurially minded and finding that person. We talked in the opening quick hit show about fit and capability, right? The good fit. You may not have all the capability, but you're a great fit. That's very rich, as much as having hugely skilled and has no people skills.
Yeah, dead right.
Okay, well, you need to be over there and we'll feed you. And then you can help that person connecting, bring the best out of both. Yeah. So it sounds like you're the entrepreneur within multiple companies in how to stitch it together to protect them against themselves and the marauders, but also set them up for success and, a lot of positive stuff out there to enable them to be comfortable that they're protected. How early can you, the conundrum is, how do you convince people to get you on earlier rather than later? You mentioned about sales, everybody's in sales. How do you get there to convince them that I'm going to help you protect yourself right from the get-go?
Yeah, you're not going to like the answer to this, but the easier person to get to is...
I'll go with any answer.
Well, maybe your listeners won't like it then, or your viewers. But the easier person to convince to come in as early as possible is someone who's not a first-time entrepreneur, someone who's been through it once or twice, because they'll have been through the process in terms of having seen things go wrong. And the reason I'm not trying to be kind of smart in saying this, but oftentimes you'll give people advice, they won't like what you have to say. They'll ignore you. They'll go off and do what they want you to do anyways. And then they'll come back and say, oh, God, I'm sorry I didn't listen to you.
It's interesting, that point, in the sense of, I learned a long time ago that putting a great lawyer around me and bringing them to the table with me was a benefit, not worrying about billable hours or how it's going, is having that, as you said in the previous, being a trusted advisor is critical, as to me, the same as an investor. You're right up there in parallel in how to think about the business, and then bringing somebody along. I sound like I'm an advocate for the advocates.
But it's nice. But it's nice to hear, because I think when you get a good lawyer who does a good job and is there from early days, people see the value and they don't mind spending that money, and they see it as an investment itself rather than an unnecessary expense. And
that's exactly the lens. It's an investment. I mean, would you go to war without somebody who understands the logistics in strategy?
Yeah.
No. So putting this troika or whatever you think that group is together as much as a board member, a trusted lawyer that can equally connect you with the other parts of the law that maybe you're not a specialist in, but you've got trusted partners you work with, maybe they're in your firm, outside of your firm, to bring the best and brightest to whatever that bespoke business model is, right?
Correct.
That sounds like very much your philosophy. I'm not trying to pitch your company, but it's refreshing to hear somebody from the space that thinks of that.
You're dead right, it is. And if you think about it from my side of the fence, there's no point in me milking it and trying to sort of over-lawyer it or act to mag it. Ultimately, it'll blow up in my face again. We were talking about the relationship. It's like a marriage when you have investors in a company and founders. It's a bit like that with the lawyer as well, if you know what I mean. We're going to be with you through thick and thin. We're going to see the good stuff and the bad. But ultimately, it has to work for both sides. There's no point in me over lawyering things, doing unnecessary things, ultimately it'll sour the relationship. It's the same thing with if you have a bad relationship with investors and founders, it's not going to work out. So that's really it, is to be honest with you. It is that trusted advisor thing. And in terms of getting in early, as I said, it's what I've tried to do in the past, and with the likes of people up in the Porter Shed, is get in front of early stage companies to sort of talk about the stuff we're talking about now and say, look, here's what I've seen go wrong in the past. The examples of, guys giving away equity at an early stage. As I said, a guy I used to work with described it as early stage companies giving away equity like snuff at a wake, if you know what I mean. Anyone who had ever spoken to someone in the company was given an equity stake. And then you get to a stage where, you do want to take on investment. You've got 40 shareholders or something on a company that's only been up and running for a couple of years. It's just banana stuff. It's stuff that could easily be avoided. Do you know what I mean? If it's all coming from a good place that the companies get themselves in these scenarios. But if they'd had the chance to speak to, either a well-experienced entrepreneur or a good lawyer who could have said, look, here's how you might approach this situation differently and make life a little bit easier for you in a year or two down the road,
So from your perspective, when you look at the supply of experts in the legal profession in Ireland, as for the sake of this conversation, are you seeing more people, more individuals specializing in tech, or is this still a fringe engagement?
There's definitely more people taking an interest in it. Like traditionally in the past, for lawyers, property was always a big one. It's us, our Irish thing. We love property, we love our land, and likewise, there was lots of transactions, so lots of lawyers specialised in it. Litigation is always going to be there; it's never going away. So that you'll always get a steady sort of plethora of people who go into litigation because it's always going to happen. Tech is definitely starting to take off, but it's a tricky one. That what is tech, and when it comes to law, what do you need to have? I mean, so my area of focus really is the corporate side of things, and I do a lot of the commercial work as well. But I mean, to be a really strong commercial tech lawyer, ideally speaking, you're going to be really strong on IP. You're going to be really strong on data protection, EU sort of data protection, and even you're going to have to be, not that you can advise on it, but you're going to have your wits about you in terms of data protection outside of the EU, because every commercial contract you enter into it's becoming an issue, if you know what I mean. You're going to have to be up on stuff like competition law. You're going to need to know your outsourcing arrangements. You're going to be a really good drafter. So it's a very broad spectrum, if you know what I mean. Then you're also going to have the dispute side of it when things start going wrong. And again, it's all well and good being, a great litigator, but you have to actually understand what you're litigating about as well. So they're coming around to it, but it's still a growing industry, I think. And the problem generally, it seems to be across a number of industries, but certainly in law and in any event at the moment, there's just a shortage of lawyers across any area of law. There's an absolute boom at the moment in terms of legal requirements. It's great to be in law. There's lots of work. There's a shortage of lawyers, but you can't get them quick enough, if you know what I mean. And you've got the UK firms are now coming into Ireland and setting up a presence, obviously as a result of Brexit, and they're swallowing up a huge amount of early stage lawyers as well, because they can offer to pay gigantic London salaries. You'll work your gigantic London hours for those salaries, but it means that, for even the big Irish firms that have been around for a long while, even they're struggling to populate their teams with the necessary skill sets, if you know what I mean. But yeah, people are getting into the tech side of it. I think people are becoming far more aware of it. It's so present in the media, the press. Everything you read about is tech. If you look at the recent sort of unicorn Irish tech businesses that have done well, Wayflyer, Flipdish, I'm sure there's other ones, or Let's Get Checked. There's so many good news stories about Irish tech companies, and these companies aren't even around 10 years, if you know what I mean. Some of them are around 5 years or less. And then even I saw a headline over the weekend that there was 1.6 billion invested in tech companies in 2021. So I mean, there's a huge amount of work going on there. There's plenty of work for lawyers to be involved in. So there'll be more interest in it, definitely, the way things are going.
Yeah, that's one of those things that it is a specialty, and it kind of is somewhat horizontal across most businesses, but then that big arc when you think of the complexities of a tech stack. So just pivoting a little bit as we start to wrap up, is software as a service. How do you engage in software as a service, and how do you blend that into a tech stack to make sure that the core is protected, but you've got the rest that's enabled?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. SaaS technology is kind of hot topic at the moment. The investors love it as well, as you probably know. It's that recurring revenue stream that the SaaS model has. People love it as opposed to that one-stop shop of buying something once, or that kind of a way. So it's certainly, people are really throwing money at that sort of quite aggressively, I would say, which is great to see. And in terms of the work we in our firm do on that side of things, like we act for a number of SaaS technology companies and work with them in a few different capacities. One in that, again, going back to the data protection issue.
So you're heavily involved in the software as a service, intellectual property side of businesses. How do you engage with them, and where do you fit in the tech stack when advising that?
Yeah, so for example, we have a number of SaaS technology companies that we do work for within MacSweeney Company. And in terms of that development side of it, as you've mentioned, we would be involved in these guys would have in-house capabilities of developing certain things themselves. Also, they'd have to outsource where they don't have the necessary skill sets. So in that situation, we help them with the outsourcing agreements. Again, going back to the point we mentioned at the early stage in our conversations, the IP ownership is critical. So you want to make sure that you've got that rock solid agreements in place, talking about the development of the IP, the ownership of the IP. What happens if some IP somehow or other is deemed at law to vest in the wrong entity? How we get it back into the actual SaaS technology company, and then sort of having actual undertakings and obligations on the outsourced provider to actually take the necessary steps to bring that IP in. So that'll be on the IP side of it, everything from that to all sorts of software development agreements. The other side of things we can sort of help with is in terms of, there's a huge amount of data processing that always goes hand in hand with the SaaS technology guys. Typically speaking, if I'm a SaaS customer, or if I'm a business customer with a lot of staff or employees that are going to be logging in to a SaaS platform, there's going to be a significant amount of personal data that's moving back and forth. So again, we can provide the advices on the data protection issues that arise, only so much as they apply within the EU. But as I was saying to you earlier, you do have to be kind of mindful of, where is the data? Where are the individuals based whose personal data has been processed, and what sort of things you need to be sort of thinking about there. And also then it comes back to the trusted advisor piece. Oftentimes we're looking at, you might be providing services into India, the United States, Africa, wherever, it could be anywhere. We will then be able to put people in touch with, look, if you want to do this properly, you need to get your legal advice in those jurisdictions as well. We can make the necessary introductions there so that they're getting the services they need in those jurisdictions. And then finally, on that side of it as well, as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of sales agreements that go with SaaS technology. So again, depending on who the end customer is, it might be that they're large blue chip companies, or it might be that it's individuals, like individual customers such as myself, signing up to some sort of a SaaS platform. But we do all of the actual sales contracts as well for a lot of these SaaS technology companies, and where that can become quite important in the bigger picture of looking at any sort of a tech company, but a SaaS technology company in particular is, again, thinking further down the line as to what's the end plan for this company. Are they looking to just keep trundling on, doing their own thing themselves, for a long period of time? Or is there a horizon event on the timeline? Do they see an exit or a large investment? And again, with that, you need to make sure that all those contracts, particularly where, the whole value base of a SaaS technology company is that recurring revenue. You want to make sure it's locked in. You want to make sure there's nothing sort of funky or smelly in those contracts that could blow up on a
technical term. I think that's a technical term.
That's how I like to describe them before you get it. But I mean,
for those that will engage MacSweeney, that's extra.
But the sort of stuff you'd be kind of concerned about there is, like if there was, say, an exit event, oftentimes you'll see there's a termination right for the customer to terminate an agreement in the event that this is an exit, and that makes sense. In certain circumstances, people don't want to be in business with potentially a large competitor of theirs. So if it's a case that, you're a SaaS technology company, you're acquired by, one large tech company, and one of your customers is one of the other big tech companies, they might not necessarily want there to be a contractual nexus there. So those sort of things you're watching out for. And then the other one, again, I don't know if we talked about this earlier or not, but like making sure that the correct policies, procedures, and governance in place as these companies grow. Or this becomes one, I think this is a different story, but it's about the same company we talked about earlier. But again, a company that was ripe for an exit, was going through the process of being acquired by a large US-based company. And we were doing our diligence exercise, going through the key contracts. And this company was doing gigantic turnover. Like, this was SaaS at a big level. But where you get to a scenario like this is obviously when the headcount grows, you have a lot of salespeople, you have sales channels and whatnot. you need to make sure you have checks and balances in place as to what contracts are being signed and entered into. And what happened in this one was some overeager salesperson got into a scenario where they obviously signed up on the customer's paperwork rather than on the company itself's paperwork. And that's always a battle of the forms, as we call it. It's a fight we lawyers have in these scenarios where the SaaS technology company wants to say, we're going to use my paperwork. The customer's like, no, I am IBM or I'm Microsoft. No, we're going to use my paperwork. But if it ultimately comes down to, look, we might end up signing their paperwork, but it'll have to be heavily reviewed by the legals to make sure there's nothing that's going to cause us heartburn in the future. But obviously, this scenario, things had slipped through the cracks, and in some of the contracts that have been assigned or been signed into, all ownership of all IP of the company.
So, the net of it is good governance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the point is
the salespeople.
Yeah,
so
exactly. That's to protect everyone. That's to make sure that everyone is protected, so that there's nothing. Who wants to be the guy that signed up the contract that sold all the IP to someone,
Well, their name will stand out in infamy. So Gavin, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. It's been a wealth of learning. And I think probably what I'm walking away is you're a savage reader and you're just on this constant learning journey. So thanks for sharing some of that with us. I know there's a lot more in there. And we'll obviously talk again. So Gavin, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me
this morning. And we both have the raspy Irish voices. I don't know what the hell's going on, but it's great to spend time with you. So with that, we are just wrapping up here. And I think some of the big takeaways of this is, number one, you need to read the Slash autobiography, because clearly that's a path that all will go down. But it is that road less taken that entrepreneurs do engage with. And that's what separates the entrepreneurs probably from and then the next category is the entrepreneurs within. Go find them and get them engaged, because they have as much passion as you as a founder. They just maybe have a different risk tolerance. Third, good governance, meaning just simply get the rules right. Have the tough prenup conversations with just as you would with, any contract, but, everybody's going into these things with their best intentions, and then stuff goes wrong, which it will. And so have it mapped out as to those scenarios and get a professional, ideally a trusted advisor, such as, Gavin, to help you think through those problems when you're focused on product and growing your company. And then these are the things that actually get you, because have the end in mind. And then, there's a lot of other things in there about investors and bringing people to the table that actually can add to the table versus squeezed onto the end of a corner and wind up with some other problems. So thanks again to Gavin Bluett, partner at MacSweeney Law in Galway, Ireland, and clearly in the middle of the tech world here. So thanks again to everybody who's tuned into Adapters TechX. Thanks also to our friends at Hunter Gatherer that power this, edit it, and make it look something more reasonable that I can create. And then equally, our friends at No Vacancy with Glenn Hausman, the #1 influencer in travel, tourism, and hospitality in the United States, where we connect Europe, America, and the Middle East and bring you the best and brightest ideas that are happening in the tech stack today. So thanks for your time, and we'll see you next week.